Welcome to Gender, Power and the Justice Institutions that Shape Our Lives, the launch webinar for the Global Justice 50/50 report. I'm James Chau. I'm joining you from Hong Kong, and it's of course a great pleasure to moderate today's discussion. Thank you for participating from all around the world. Let me start with a simple but hopefully uncomfortable question. Who decides what justice looks like and for whom? At a time when justice systems around the world are under unprecedented strain, this question could not be more urgent. Courts are increasingly politicized, access to justice is narrowing, public trust in institutions meant to uphold rights is fraying, and alongside this, we're witnessing a growing global backlash against gender equality and women's rights. These challenges are often framed as technical or distant matters for lawyers, judges, or policymakers, but they're certainly not abstract. They shape whether women can escape violence, whether workers can challenge exploitation, whether communities can defend land and livelihoods, and whether governments can be held to account. Justice institutions are not just guardians of principle, they are workplaces, they are centers of power. And who leads them, that means whose voices dominate, whose perspectives are missing, profoundly shapes whose rights are recognized and protected. Justice institutions are at their best when they're fair, transparent, and accountable, and when leadership truly reflects the societies they exist to serve. When that is not the case, fairness becomes fragile. Today's launch of the Global Justice 50/50 report brings together evidence to this very conversation. The report is the very first systematic comparative assessment of gender equality across 171 global law and justice institutions. This report looks not only at who holds leadership positions, but also at whether institutions have the policies, data, and accountability mechanisms that are needed to advance fairness and equity in practice. Well, a few quick housekeeping points before we begin our time together. Today's session is being recorded. Teams also provides options for closed captioning and live translation, which you can select at the very top of your window under More. We'll have time for audience questions later in this program, and we invite you warmly to submit those in writing using the Q&A function at any point during the discussion. So if you feel inspired, please join in. Also, feel free to say hello and introduce yourselves in the Q&A as well. We're going to begin with a presentation of the key findings from the Global Justice 50/50 report. We'll then move into a moderated panel discussion with three esteemed leaders from the law and justice sector, followed by a wider audience Q&A time together. We'll close with reflections and next steps from the co-CEOs of Global 50/50. So with that, allow me to introduce you to our first speaker, Govindi Deerasinghe, Justice Lead at Global 50/50. And while we're hearing from Govindi, I encourage you all to reflect on how your own organization will perform in each of the areas and how we might all bring about change. Govindi, it's over to you.
Thank you so much for the really warm welcome, James. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you that are tuning in for our very first webinar. And this comes at the culmination of a couple of years of very hard work on Global Justice 50/50 and many, many years of Global 50/50's work. So I will start with a really quick introduction of who Global 50/50 is, our work in the sector before delving deep into our key findings. First, Global 50/50. We are an independent think tank based in Cambridge, and we started about 8 years ago in the global health sector primarily. And our mission is to inform, inspire, and incite action and accountability for gender justice in society. We do this in a multitude of ways. Our flagship reports and accompanying indices, now in justice as well as the health sector, review the performance and practices of organizations that are active in public health, in health policy, as well as across the law and justice sector. We also produce these how-to guides to help organizations and employees who want to inspire their own organizations to review their policies to improve the gender equality, fairness, and equity principles, and to create fairer and inclusive workplaces. As well as those publications, we also look to raise awareness of the role of gender justice in determining health policy, in determining access to justice for all. And we do this in, again, several different ways. As well as our reports through Global 50/50, all of our brilliant academics here participate in dissemination efforts, in debates. We produce academic publications, and Global 50/50 also has convenings for multiple different stakeholders across all of these sectors that we're active in. We additionally, as you can see from these slides here today and in our report, have this wonderful This is Gender image collection, where we want to shift the narratives that exist in photojournalism and on the subject of gender in photography. And finally, we engage with leaders and key stakeholders in these two sectors and beyond to highlight the benefits of placing gender at the heart of everything that they do and how much of an important factor it is in advancing social justice. We place transparent data in the hands of both organization leaders and their employees, because we find that it's always the people who are in the organizations themselves and are affected by that work that need to be empowered to create the change that the organizations need to be at the forefront of. Moving on to Global Justice 50/50. When we first began this work in the health sector, we had our foreword written by the very first report. The foreword was written by Amina Mohammed, who, as well as reflecting on the findings in that first report, asked and called for this work to be repeated across sectors. So a couple of years ago, we expanded into this new and complex sector of law and justice. The reason why we wanted to look at this sector is because justice sits at the heart of everybody's lives, no matter what position in society they have. And through empirical research, we know that gender parity and gender justice in the law and justice sector delivers better gender justice outcomes. We see, especially in the work of the tribunals in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, for example, how the presence of women judges has not only resulted in more stringent punishments for those involved in gender-based crimes, but also convinced the other judges sitting on those panels who may not be feminist-oriented to review those cases more intersectionally as well. We know that from this empirical evidence that the quality of judicial decision-making also improves with a diversity of judges on benches. As well as that, having diverse panels, having diverse lawyers increases public trust in the sector, because the public sees themselves represented in those institutions that determine their lives and create norms and rules and practices that affect their lives. And when there is representation, they feel that they can believe more in the outcomes. We also know that from the private sector, organizational performance and profitability can also be enhanced. Law firms with better representation see better rates of retention, more qualitative examples of commitment to the work of those firms. And finally, we know that having representation at the heads of these institutions expands access to justice and equity in service delivery. We see a wider range of harms being addressed in the courts and a wider range of services offered through the law firms and in other political organizations that deal with law and justice. Knowing all of this, we therefore sought to look at what organizations are doing that are active in law and justice across the globe. The central question that we sought to answer is, do global law and justice organizations uphold the principles of gender equality, fairness, and equity in their work and their workplaces? We do this by looking at the entire life cycle of how an organization interacts with gender and gender justice. First, we look at, and I'll go into these in a little bit more detail when we look at the findings, but we look at the public-facing commitments that an organization makes. Then we look internally at their gender equality policies as applicable to both appointed bodies and staff. We look at beyond gender, also other dimensions of fairness and equity. And then we look outwards again as to how monitoring and implementation of programmatic efforts are disaggregated by sex. And who exactly are we assessing? So in this very first Global Law and Justice report, we decided to look at 171 organizations based on a conceptualization exercise that we produced into an options paper that several important stakeholders across the sectors and the subsectors fed back on. And we separated our sample into 7 different subsectors, as you can see here. They encompass the global and regionally adjudicatory bodies, so that's courts and tribunals and other dispute resolution mechanisms. We also looked at commissions and expert mechanisms and intergovernmental organizations. We looked at civil society through the international NGOs and the private sector with law firms and legal professional associations, whether that's networks of national bars or membership associations at the global level. And finally, we also looked at funders and philanthropies who are active in the global law and justice sector. A few notes on our methodology here as well. So this applies to all of Global 50/50 report and research. We work at the intersection of these 3 SDGs. And the SDG 10 on reduced inequalities, SDG 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions, and SDG 5 on gender equality. Our data is collected by 2 researchers working independently and reviewed by a 3rd researcher. We look at only what is publicly available on the websites of the organizations and any funding instruments. This is because we believe that transparency is key for both employees and those who require access to justice. And finally, we also contact the organizations throughout the research process so they have the opportunity to validate their data. Right, this is the key bit then. We're going on to what we actually found, and I'll distill down what ended up being about a 180-page report into just a few key findings. We'll share some links at the end so that you can go and do a deeper dive into the report and also into the different subsectors which have their own standalone mini reports that you can go through. Going back to those variables that we assessed, the first one, public-facing commitments. We found that half of the 171 organizations in our sample publicly commit to gender equality. But when you look at gender equality policies for the workplace, this reduces to 44%. And for fairness and diversity policies, this reduces again to 41%. In the case of courts and commissions, where the perhaps key actors are not staff as such, but are appointed into their offices, we split these up into gender equality policies and fairness and equality policies for how those individuals are appointed in terms of selections, but also what the organizations may have control over, i.e. how the bench works in terms of who is appointed as the president or vice president, or how the workings in terms of special committees or working groups are divided. So again, for 22 courts, we only found 3 that had a gender equality policy for bench selections and 2 for workings. And for commissions, only 1 had a gender equality policy for the commissioners and none had any for the workings. And this pattern is repeated again in the fairness and equity policies. Who sits at the top of these organizations is a much starker picture. We found that women make up 43% of power holders, but this actually hides a lot greater disparity in what we would term the traditional hubs of legal power, i.e. what people typically associate with law and justice, that is the courts, the law firms. We have a big sample of data collected from 302 top office holders, of which 40% are women, and of 5,224 women who sit in senior positions across these organizations, 43% are women. When you bring geography into this, it's an even starker image. Fewer than 1% of the highest offices globally are held by women from low-income countries, especially in comparison to how many of these positions are held by men from the US alone. Of the 1,895 senior positions, The proportion of men from the US then increases to the point of, out of 298 highest officers, you see 25%, up from 12% across those 1,895. And very finally, if you look again at that external facing commitments to disaggregation of data and to undertake gender analysis, fewer than 1 in 5 of these organizations are committed to understanding who is and who is not being served by their systems. And if you want to go further into the report and look at the specific details of who's doing what and where there's still progress to be made, please use this QR code, and we'll also share a link in the chat so that you can go and read the report. I'll hand back over to you, James, so that we can have our panelists speak on these findings.
Thank you very much. You just heard there from Govindi Deerasinghe, who is the Justice Lead over at Global 50/50. Govindi, that was a really clear and thought-provoking presentation that sets up the rest of the conversation to follow. You've heard some very stark findings to our audience, persistent concentrations of power, and really serious gaps between commitments, policies, and outcomes. We'll now turn to our panel to explore why this matters and what needs to change. I'm really delighted to be joined by 3 distinguished panelists who bring deep personal experience from across the justice ecosystem. Honourable Commissioner Janet R. Sallah-Njie, Vice Chair of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa. She's also a member of the Global Justice 50/50 Advisory Council. She's joined by the Honourable Madam Justice Nadia Kangaloo, High Court Judge in the Judiciary of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and President of the Caribbean Association of Women Judges. And we also have with us Melene Rossouw, who's over in Cape Town, a lawyer, human rights advocate, public servant, founder of the Women Lead Movement, and member of the Global Justice 50/50 Advisory Council. And I've got a whole list of questions to run through with the 3 of you, but I thought before we jump in, why don't we take a step back and reflect on what Govindi just gave us there. Perhaps a deep dive, a quick round to get your reactions to what Govindi's just shared. And in 1 minute each, here's a question. What did you find most significant about the findings or the report more generally? Madam Justice, let's begin with you.
Thank you, James, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. No doubt what Govindi has just presented is a sobering view. But for me, as a sitting woman and judge, it reflects and resonates with my lived experience. But for me, I'm the eternal optimist, James, and the takeaway from the report is that we can move with a certain degree of comfort beyond representation. Gender parity on the bench, particularly in the Caribbean, we're on the cusp of that if we've not exceeded it. And for me, what the report brings to bear is we have to focus on legitimacy now. The report speaks to the question of who sits in positions of power. Govindi touched on that. And the question that now arises is how is that power exercised? And for justice institutions, how does that strengthen public trust in the institution? So that's the takeaway for me off the top of the bat.
Thank you very much. Moving to Madam Commissioner, in a minute, what's your reaction? What's top of mind?
Thank you very much, James. I think what has become very clear from the report and from the presentation by Govindi is that justice institutions remain overwhelmingly dominated by men, particularly men from high-income countries, especially in most of the powerful leadership roles. And this, to me, as the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa, exposes a deep structural imbalance of both gender and geography at the very top of systems that are meant to deliver justice worldwide. And this matters because the structural imbalance that uphold justice and fairness may instead reproduce inequality from within. And this is a matter of concern for all of us. So it is important that these institutions that are meant to dispense justice, and coming from Africa, when I say justice, I'm not talking about the formal court system. I'm talking about the formal court system, the informal, traditional, and religious courts also, where they're primarily dominated by men. In fact, within the religious court system, we don't even have any woman there in most of the countries that we have jurisdiction over. So these are matters of concern. And as has been rightly indicated by the Honorable Justice, it's a matter of legitimacy. Because if people don't see themselves in institutions that are supposed to deliver justice for them, it might be difficult for them to have legitimacy or to respect those institutions or to expect that justice will be evenly dispensed. So this is a matter of concern.
Thank you, Commissioner. Let's move now to Melene Rossouw. You heard not only what Govindi said, but also what the Justice and the Commissioner has been talking about as well. You bring in something obviously unique and different of your own. What is coming to your mind as we speak and as you hear, and what you feel?
My view is very much linked to that which Commissioner Sallah-Njie has just indicated. I believe that this report ultimately, and I'm going to speak here from an activistic perspective, it does reveal or expose a legitimacy gap within justice institutions, specifically these justice institutions that were studied during this particular report. And why is that significant, James? It's significant because justice institutions, by its very nature, derive their authority and legitimacy from the public and public trust. And if they fail to demand internally what they externally demand, it does create a credibility crisis, especially from institutions that purport to uphold the rule of law and that ascribes to principles of justice and fairness. And in the medium to long term, James, the consequences can be dire. It can mean an erosion of public trust, not only within these institutions of justice, but within the justice system as a whole. And that will create a ripple effect with multiple other consequences.
Thank you very much for those quick reactions. Let's dive into those questions that we have been preparing. Justice Kangaloo, you said something at the top of your reaction which really intrigued me. You not only commented, but you referenced the lived experience, as you described it, that you have felt along the way in your own long and distinguished career. As someone who served at the very highest levels of judicial leadership, you've actually seen yourself firsthand of how institutions are structured and how power actually operates and materializes within them. With that deep well of insight, what stands out most in these findings, and how do these patterns, whether we're talking about gender or inequality more widely, resonate with what you've seen within that lived experience that you initially touched on?
All right, so I think it's clear, certainly in the Caribbean, I can't speak to other jurisdictions, but that there's been an exponential influx of women into the legal profession. And as a result of that, an increase in the number of women who are joining judicial institutions and the legal profession generally. However, there's a disconnect in terms of the increase in the number of women and leadership culture and the norms. They've been slower to progress, match that increase in the number of women. So for me, that is certainly something that resonates. It's part of my lived experience. In my jurisdiction of Trinidad and Tobago, 3/4 of our judicial office holders are women, 74%. But we're yet to have a female Chief Justice, and I'll leave that there for now. I also want to say that while I think that we've achieved diversity on the bench, when you look at a Caribbean bench, you do see a significant number of women judges sitting there. It's not just symbolic. We're not there as a gesture, as Govindi has touched on, and as my other co-panelists have touched on. When you see yourself, when the public sees themselves on in a person sitting on the bench, it resonates with them. It resonates with how they understand and perceive justice and how they experience it. So at the end of the day, for me, a takeaway is that if we're, as institutions, judicial institutions, looking to achieve neutrality, we have to overcome, we have to propel ourselves beyond the thresholds of history, our colonial history, the hierarchical structure, and our cultures. And that's what the report invites us to examine. And it's really, really important to listen to the voices. Listen to the voices of your women judges. Listen to the voices of your court staff. itself, and the report touches on that. And in fact, I shared with Govindi when we were speaking in preparation for today that the Caribbean Association of Women Judges, the CAWJ, and the Caribbean Association of Judicial Officers, CAJO, together last year, we conducted a survey on judicial well-being. The formal report will be issued this quarter, and many of the women identified the challenges. Again, there's diversity on the Caribbean bench, but the challenges they identified, they're not personal challenges, they're structural challenges, speaking to things like workload expectations, respect, institutional culture, and of course, the ever-present concern about balancing their professional and their personal responsibilities. So for me, the question again goes beyond not just access, but what are lived experiences within the judicial system and how we can ameliorate that.
Well, the report warns that when power is inequitably distributed and accountability is weak, going along with that, justice institutions risk undermining legitimacy and trust. Madam Commissioner, through your leadership within the African Union system as a legal expert and women's rights advocate, you're often operating at that very interface between justice institutions, states, and accountability mechanisms. So what do you think about this warning? How real is that risk to legitimacy and trust? And where do you see it playing out most clearly from where you sit?
Thank you very much, James. Before I start, I'm in awe with what is happening in the Caribbean in terms of the numbers and the representation. Very a far cry from what we have in the African continent. But having said that, we know that the real impact and effect in terms of leadership and decision making is still lagging behind, but it's still commendable that we have that there. I just wanted to comment on that. But coming back to my question, I think, James, the warning is not only theoretical, it is deeply real. And we're already seeing its effects as has been revealed by the report. Because as I indicated initially, when justice institutions do not reflect the people they serve, particularly women and marginalized communities, and when accountability mechanisms are weak or politicized, you find that legitimacy erodes quietly. And by saying that, I mean that people must be able to see themselves. These mechanisms must reflect the communities and must also reflect the lived realities of the communities that they're supposed to dispense justice to. And trust is not lost overnight. It is lost when victims do not see themselves represented, and when decisions appear insulated from lived realities, and when accountability feels selective rather than principled. This is something that we have to bear in mind. And across the African continent, I'm not talking about the regional level, but even at the national level, because our responsibility to African Commission is not only to dispense justice at the regional level, but also to monitor what happens at the national level, and also to guide states in terms of compliance with all the instruments, human rights instruments that the AU has adopted. So this risk is most visible where gender-based violence cases we find stall without consequences at the national level, where we find judicial appointments lacking transparency in some contexts, and also at the level of the regional mechanisms also, where decisions are delayed or implementation is partial. Because, I mean, it's one thing to have very transparent jurisprudence, it's another thing for the instrument jurisprudence to be implemented. Because as the regional mechanisms, when we dispense justice, we make recommendations, or when we make binding decisions, we cannot force those decisions to be implemented. It requires voluntary implementation by the states, and these are some of the challenges we have. So in these moments, institutions remain formally intact, but their moral authority begins to weaken when you don't actually implement the decisions, or when there's a perception that it might be just a waste of time, or when representation is not reflecting the societies that these institutions are supposed to actually dispense justice to. For a body like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, operating within the broader framework of the African Union, legitimacy rests not only on legal mandates, because the mandate is there on the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, but on credibility, independence, and responsiveness. That is when states respond, because we're, like you said, an interface between the commissioners, the states, and at the AU organs. So it is important that justice institutions, locally at the African Commission with the AU mechanisms, we have a policy, open policy of having a representation being balanced, but it goes beyond that also. So it is important that the perception that people have in terms of transparency, in terms of the politics of the election, is also very important. So these are things that we have to bear in mind. Also, as I indicated at the very beginning, within the context of the African Commission and in Africa, really, it's not only about the formal court system. We have plural legal systems. You have the normal courts, we have the customary courts, and we have the religious courts. And apart from the fact that the number of women that have been represented in the formal courts is on the rise, it's increasing, which is commendable, not up to the level of the Caribbean, but it's still increasing gradually. But in the traditional setup, where the majority of the people of the continent have their first access to justice, because people live in very remote rural communities, they may not have access to the formal court systems. So the traditional system is the only access that they have. You find that women are not represented there. So disputes are actually being adjudicated upon basically by men, and women are not represented. And this actually has its impact in terms of the kind of justice that is dispensed, the terms of response to matters related to gender-based violence, child marriage, harmful traditional practices. So these are some of the things that we also have to bear in mind. And when women are excluded from traditional leadership, they're excluded from first instance justice. And the African Commission is trying to remedy this situation, because we recently had a case where one of the member states, where a woman was being deprived of acceding to the chieftaincy, because in those settings, the chiefs and the traditional leaders that dispense justice. And the African Commission was able to make a finding against the state that is discriminatory based on the provisions of the Maputo Protocol. So gradually we're getting there, but we still have a long way to go. So this is the,
I mean, this is really incredible. Again, this body of evidence that, again, links to the lived experience, Madam Commissioner. I want to link what you have just said to Melene, who, of course, is another voice that agitates from the ground, both as a lawyer and as an activist who works closely with the institutions that we're speaking about and with civil society actors. Melene, you've seen firsthand the gap between institutional commitments and the actual practice of that. Why do you think justice institutions struggle to translate the commitments that they make up front on equality into real outcomes and organizational change? And where and who can we look to for pockets of change and progress that we can then, unfurl and say, we make that a movement rather than an occasional happening?
Absolutely. And I think that's a very critical question for this discussion to have. Perhaps as a response, before I deal with the barriers that does not allow us to move from commitment to organizational change, how we will reach there is if we have three elements in place. One, accountability, leadership courage, and sustained external pressure. Once these three elements converge, it will transform not only who has a seat at the table, but who ultimately sets the agenda and drives the agenda within these justice institutions. So as an answer to the questions, that is actually what we need in order to move from commitments to organizational change. Now, let's look at the fun part, the barriers to why we are not achieving what we need to achieve. The first one, very obvious one, James, is the protection of power. We have to remember that the justice system and justice institution by extension was designed to be occupied by a very narrow demographic, which we see is still occupying those particular spaces. Now, when their power is being threatened within that current system, and especially when they derive benefit from that system, they will resist change. Whether that is intentional or unintentional, it does occur. And you will normally see that manifesting itself through, for example, tokenistic representations. You'll see it manifest through slow implementation of commitments within organizations. And the best part, the tick box diversity policies. They're very good in drafting policies to be compliant, but not really to drive transformation. The second element, or barrier, is the weakened accountability mechanism or lack of accountability mechanism. Now, you can have a commitment, you can even have a policy, but if there's no implementation plan, if there's no measurable targets, and most importantly, if there's no consequences for your non-compliance, then there's no motivation for you to achieve organizational change at all. And that needs to change. In fact, that is a gap for civil society organizations to actually play a greater role in. And that is to hold institutions accountable for these commitments, but not only the commitments per se, but actually the targets that they set for themselves. And then lastly, one of the big barriers, and this is not the only, this is not the closed list of barriers, is the fact that representation is mistaken for transformation. Some institutions assume that because they have women in leadership, that that automatically equates to progress. Presence is not power. What we do need is those women in leadership to actually have control over resources, how that resource is spent, where it's spent, when it's spent. They must have the ability to influence the agenda, influence how the agenda is set and how that agenda is being driven. And of course, most importantly, they must influence decision-making within that institution. Now, pockets of progress. I'm going to mention one. My favorite one, of course, is feminist leadership within justice institutions, like my two colleagues here. We do need reformed-minded insiders, judges, prosecutors, senior leaders, to really drive a change within the institutional culture. And once you have more feminist leaders within these institutions, you will start seeing more inclusive workplace policies. You will start seeing more transparent accountability frameworks. And you will start seeing a very, very obvious shift in the culture and the normative framework within that institution. So that is my response to that, James.
Thank you so much, Melene. I will plunge into a quick round of closing questions, but before we do, we encourage everybody who's watching here. You're not an observer, you're not a bystander. We need you to be part of this conversation. So please drop in your questions, your ideas, your thoughts in a short script on the Q&A feature on this live experience. So again, it doesn't have to be a question, it could be a thought, an idea, or response to what you're hearing. Please drop it in right now. Let's quickly go for some closing questions to Justice Kangaloo first. You spent much of your career promoting dialogue and action around judicial well-being, especially, but not only for women judges. If you could change the internal features of justice institutions to accelerate the outcomes of gender justice, say selection processes, leadership culture, workload, caregiving assumptions, or accountability mechanisms, or even if you said perhaps a first Chief Justice for Trinidad and Tobago, where would you begin? Where is that ABC, or where is the A of that ABC?
So it will come as no surprise to you that there are 2 days on the calendar that fill me with great joy, James. One is a recognition of an International Day of Women Judges. That's the 10th of March. Watch this space for the CAWJ celebrations in that regard. And also the International Day of Judicial Wellbeing, which came out of the work that went into the Narrow Declaration. So for me, well-being holds a special place in my heart, and it's really important. I say that in the Caribbean, we have achieved what I described, but I think Ms. Rossouw touched on it as well. It's not just about the representation. It's what we do when we get there and what is done to support us while we're there. So it's not just a question of us delivering judgments and ensuring that they're executed, but it's also about a culture that supports how we live and how we work. And, judicial institutions need to recognize that the strength in our judiciaries is not so much about how much we endure as sitting judicial officers, and we do endure a lot, but importantly, how we structure the conditions under which we deliver justice, how we perform. That is really important. As I said, that survey that we did really highlighted that women judges are not asking for personal dispensations. We're not asking for a one-off case-by-case, I need a day off because my kid is sick, that sort of situation. What we want is institutional reform. We want diversity built into the system so that there is recognition that we need that support so that we can deliver the justice and build that public strength. So for me, we're not asking for individual coping mechanisms as women judges, but systemic support and a respectful culture. That is what will support that representation being more meaningful and carrying with it more power. All right. So that would be my my parting position.
Something really fundamental to the architecture of things from where we sit. Thanks very much, Madam Justice. We're running a bit short on time, but I do want to make sure we can hear quickly also on this question from Madam Justice Kangaloo, who spent, Madam Commissioner Sallah-Njie, because your career really spans sectors. We look at the public sector, you've moved to private practice, to the United Nations, to the EU, but also the World Bank. When you take a look at that as a whole, what do you really take away in terms of, has anything shifted in terms of leadership norms in justice institutions? And how is the African Union institutionalizing those gains across its own justice bodies?
Thank you very much, James. James, actually, what shifts leadership norms in justice institutions is not rhetoric. It is deliberate and intentional redesign. Across my experience in the public service and also working with multilateral institutions and development finance bodies as consultant, the real breakthrough came when gender equality became moved from being a moral appeal to become an institutional requirement. When you have parity targets written into appointments processes, where shortlists become transparent and clear, and selection criteria are published, and data on representation are disclosed, and most importantly, accountability was tied to performance and credibility. That is where you have the shift. So the lesson is very simple and powerful, and that is what gets measured gets protected. So if you actually make it a target, it gets protected. And once it's protected, then it gets institutionalized. So this is very important that we must focus attention on that. Within the African Union framework, as you've indicated, how we've leveraged on this, we're beginning to see that shift is taking root through our electoral processes, gender policy commitments, peer review mechanism, and strengthened mandates within bodies such as the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Gender equality is increasingly framed not as an advocacy, but as a governance. So it is an imperative, and it is a mandatory obligation that we must have gender parity in all our organs of the AU at all levels. And we have instruments like the Maputo Protocol that have elevated women's rights from aspiration to binding continental commitments. So this is the experience we have at the African Commission. And institutionalizing gains requires moving from representation and to culture, as has been rightly alluded to by my colleagues. It's not only about representation, but culture is important. It means ensuring that appointments are not only negotiated quietly, that implementation of decisions is monitored transparently, efficiently, and effectively for the benefit of the citizens of the continent, and that plural legal systems, that constitutional, customary, and religious law are all aligned with continental human rights norms, which is a challenge we have in our continent to the plural legal systems, and how the conflict of laws work in terms of our human rights norms and how they sit within the other laws. So this is very important. And the opportunity before the African Union is historic really, by embedding gender parity, transparency, and enforceability in terms of accountability into the justice system and our bodies. We're diversifying leadership, and it is also defining what legitimate authority looks like on our continent. So we should remember that inclusive leadership is not symbolic, it is structural. That transparency is not administrative, and that it is transformative, and accountability is not punitive, it is productive. Protective. So this is very important. And this is very important to the issue of the deeper issue of legitimacy, which is not inherited, but demonstrated. It has to be demonstrated so that at least in all our institutions, we don't just have the documents there, but in the way we work, the way we carry out our work, we have to demonstrate so that the people of the continent that we have responsibility for will have trust in our decision-making processes. We should all remember that inclusive leadership is not symbolic. As I said, it is structural. It is very important that we actually focus attention on those and ensure that we are transformative and deliberate in the policies we have that ensures gender parity and ensures that justice is transformative, not only formal justice, but transformative, substantive equality. I think this is very important.
Well, this is an excellent jump-off point into my last intervention with Melene. You founded the Women Lead movement. We heard that right at the start, which equips women to lead social change in their own communities and are deeply engaged in human rights activism and active citizenry. What are you seeing in those spaces that you work with so intricately? And what role can external pressure from civil society funders, but also professional bodies, pay that extra special attention to in driving institutional transformation?
Thank you, James. First of all, coming from that space, I have to say that I have immense respect for actors within the civil society space, and then added to that the funders, which I'll deal with, and professional bodies, but specifically civil society organizations like your Global Justice 50/50. Why? Because they play a very catalytic role, especially when institutions are stubborn, they are slow and they are resistant to change, or worse yet, they are invested to maintain the status quo. You know, those ones are very tough to work with. But what these civil society organizations ultimately does is that they strengthen accountability. How do they do that? They do that through monitoring the implementation of commitments, by exposing the gaps, you know, and compelling these institutions not to move from their promises into action. Now, in civil society, from where I come from, and organizations like Global Justice 50/50, it will look like research reports, you know, to provide these data-driven evidence. And that's important because once you have the evidence, once you understand the problem, you then develop the strategy. And that obviously that momentum assists with effecting change. They do that through advocacy, public education, media engagement, and my favorite, but no one talks about it, is litigation. You can actually take these institutions to court and win. And we've seen global reforms right across the world that's been driven by civil society organizations who took institutions to court and won the case. So I'm just giving Global Justice 50/50 some ideas here. With regards to the funders, and this is an important one as well, James, because most of these institutions are dependent on funds. And looking at what is happening globally, okay, there's a shrinkage in the funding. So the competition is getting more, you know, tougher around who gets the funding. That is an opportunity for funders to use this to actually embed within their funding criteria equity requirements, and then to link the resources to their performance. And if they want change, and if they are serious about change, and I'm talking to the funders now, then they will do the right thing and embed equity requirements in funding criteria. And then obviously the professional bodies, they play a very important role for us as lawyers, you know, because they govern us. And if they can start enforcing ethical standards and start enforcing disciplinary measures against those organizations, those law firms was not promoting gender equity in the way that they should, then I think we'll definitely see some drastic change. And then lastly, I think they also play a role in terms of sustaining momentum. Okay, there's nothing as hectic as a civil society organizations. Once they know about you and they know there's problems within that institution, they won't let go. They will track you for years and years and years. They will put the evidence out in the public domain like they are doing today, and we will be debating about it and strategizing around how we are going to change it. What I like about civil society organizations is that they keep the key issues that is affecting society on the policy and public agenda. And I think there they play a very critical role. Thanks, James.
Thank you so much, Melene. You know, before we wrap up and start tying things together, we invited questions from the audience, and we had a really thought-provoking one from Kanishk, who asks, what are the small examples in the everyday that would break the status quo? So a variation on what we've been discussing so far. Let me say that again. What are the small examples in the everyday that would break the status quo? Who wants to respond to that? Madam Justice, you're on mute.
I was just jotting.
Yeah.
No, what the small examples for me would be is if I were to have my peers check in with me, my male and female peers check in with me, particularly, that would have been very important for me at the beginning of my judicial career. I think it is, as judicial officers, we tend to work very much in silos, and it can be quite an isolating job. And so for my senior peers, those peers at my level, and even those who work with me, my court staff, checking in with me, that would be a really important. I've had a difficult case. It's been made public. My face is splashed all across the newspapers. My mother is calling me to find out if I'm all right. Check in with me, but not even on those days, every day. Maybe some sort of create a space where we can check in with one another. And I'm just proud. I'm going to give a shout out. I'm hoping some of them are listening. I've created such a space within my judiciary. We're called the We Wellness Warriors, and we check in with each other every day. So shout out to them. So creating that space for checking in on us. That would be my small example. But I'm certain Madam Commissioner and Ms. Rossouw would have other examples. I don't know if we have time, James.
Well, we do, because I was going to ask everybody, but I think you've just kicked it off at the same time, Madam Justice. My question was going to be, in 1 minute, what is the single most important action that justice organizations should take in the next 12 months using this report as a baseline? If I may, Madam Justice, borrow your example to launch us into that. So creating spaces, but also building that kind of culture and solidarity and impact and meaningful environment so people can actually feel confident, not only empowered, but they feel they're safe and they feel that they're going to get rewarded for that. So we've got our first idea from Madam Justice. Madam Commissioner, in 60 seconds or less, what is your idea? Melene after that.
Thank you very much. I think building on the justice, I think having a very supportive ecosystem is very important. The justice talked about what happened in the workplace, your colleagues, but also in our communities, because in Africa, we're told that it takes a community to raise a child. And having that ecosystem that supports you. For example, my experience has been that having a supportive family, like a father who taught me at a very early stage that, you know, you can be whatever you want to be, actually helped me in all my career, and that is why I'm where I am today, and I'm very grateful for that. And I don't take that for granted, because I come from a context where not all the girls that grew up with me had that kind of context and environment. So beyond the workspace and colleagues, also the family, the in-laws, and the social system also needs to be responsive and supportive. That's very important. But the one thing I would like to say is that for us to be able, in fact, one particular issue that we must focus attention in the next 12 months, as we've indicated, is to embed mandatory public reported gender parity and accountability requirements into the core governance rules of justice institutions. It has to be mandatory, and we tie them to appointments, funding, and performance reviews. And if justice institutions are serious about legitimacy, the next few months should be dedicated to moving from aspiration to obligation. So obligation, obligation, obligation. And of course, I also believe in litigation, as my colleague has already indicated. Thank you.
And Melene, to wrap things up, inspire us.
No, just 2 points on that. I want to touch on the funders again. This is a serious one, because once the funding gets taken away, there's very little that you can boast about. There's no power, because you have nothing in that system that is benefiting you. So the funders, I'm going to speak to you. I think it's time that you demand transformation. There has to be gender transformation within the justice, law and justice institutions. And you have the power in your hand to ensure that equity requirements are embedded within what you expect of that institution that you are funding. In fact, it should actually be a huge disappointment if you do not take this heat seriously. And then, second of all, just a message to the fellow civil society organizations out there: continue with the pressure on these institutions. Do not let go. Ensure that you work with other organizations to become a stronger voice, amplify the challenges, tell the stories, and do not back down, because this is only the start. And I also understand that, I mean, a lot of these organizations will now start moving very quickly, so because the data is out there, they will start moving towards progress. The more we can put these stories out there, put it on the agenda, let the public know what is going on, I promise you that pressure is going to push them to transform. And that is what we need to do.
Thank you.
Well, this is a fantastic way just to tell you that we're receiving a couple more questions as we speak. We won't have time to hear these questions being responded to by our panelists, but perhaps we can think about it, have it articulated here, and work on these once this report is launched. The work is only just beginning, of course. One person came in and said, how do panelists suggest that citizens can put public pressure and support you as leaders to make a difference in the issues raised by the report. So it's not just coming to you as the leaders with the answers always and the solutions, but how can citizens support you and work together to get the results that the report advocates for? And another question here is, do you have guidance on persuading funders to shift sectors for CSO survival and independent influence? So a lot for us there to think about over the course of the next coming days. I want to thank all of you for your thoughtful questions and responses, but I also would like to invite Professor Sarah Hawkes and Professor Kent Buse. They're the co-CEOs, as we know, of Global 50/50, and they've got some final reflections to share with us now.
Thanks to our expert, our experienced, and our very inspiring panelists. It's really an honor to have had you with us today. Picking up on the last point around funders, we were 5 years into our reporting in the global health sector before we started naming and shaming the worst performers and sending that information directly to funders. We didn't think it would be that strategic to do it in our first justice report, but let's see if we get there. At the start of today's conversation, James asked an uncomfortable question, which you all just ran with, and it's about who decides what justice looks like and for whom. And I think, as the panel made abundantly clear, it's not a rhetorical question. It's rather an invitation to consider what I think is one, or what we think is one, of the defining political questions of our time. And obviously the report is about gender and leadership in these institutions, but as Justice Kangaloo in her first intervention and the other panelists made very clear as well, what this is ultimately about is it's about power. It's about who holds power, how it's organized, how it's defended, and how it's held accountable. We heard about that a lot today, and how it's defended, and how it can be transformed. And I think we'll all agree that across the world, we're living through a moment of profound contestation, rupture over, for example, rights, that relates directly to this conversation. We see it in attacks on reproductive autonomy. We see the dismantling of gender equality and gender justice frameworks. We see it, as we've heard, in shrinking civic space. We see it, and we've heard today about feeling it in relation to the pressure on independent institutions who the powerful want to see conform or retreat or stay silent. Policies like the US expanded Mexico City policies, they're not isolated exercises of power. They're part of a wider global project that seeks to reassert control over bodies, over knowledge, over institutions. And as we've been hearing today, the justice sector is very much not outside of this. It's very much embedded in it. It's part of it. It's the courts, it's the law firms, it's the professional bodies. They're not neutral actors. They're part of an architecture through which power is exercised and reproduced. And we've heard today that when power is narrow in these institutions, when they're homogeneous, they're not seen as legitimate, and thus they're not able to respond to the kinds of pressures that they're under right now, and they're less able to resist. We also heard that that these very institutions in the justice sector are situated within societies where the structural forces actually limit choices and chances within the institution. So it's this, it's a vicious circle. But it's not just a moment of risk and rupture. It's also a moment about possibility, and that's what we hope our initiative and our community can be about. We know from decades of organizing among feminists, among women's leadership, among unions, that power can be reimagined and that institutions can be forced to change. And we've had some ideas around how to start doing that. But we've also heard that change happens faster when people learn together, when they organize together, and when they do, as James said, do that in solidarity. And our work at Global 50/50, on the one hand, has been about measuring inequality, taking that first step to hold organizations to account. But we want to be seen as a space where we create shared evidence that open doors for the kind of dialogue that we're having now. It's about convening leaders and frontline staff who are committed to gender justice. It's about supporting, as it came up today, how to operationalize those feminist principles that have been advocated for on the panel today. And it's about building a community that's interested in understanding how power works in society and is prepared to engage with it in an honest way. And in moments of backlash, isolation is dangerous. It depends on creating partnerships. And so we're grateful to you for example, creating safe spaces. And we want to do that as well. We want to learn across sectors. We want to work with institutions that want to work with us and work collectively. And so that's the invitation that we're really, Sarah and I and Global 5050 are trying to extend today through this work in the justice sector. I think I'm going to leave it there and just ask Sarah to come in with any final reflections.
Thank you, Kent. I'll just, I'm not going to give any further reflections. I'm just going to give a vote of thanks to everybody. So first of all, we've heard a lot of mention of the funders, the good, the bad, the indifferent, the absent, the present. But I do want to give a public acknowledgement to the philanthropic funders who have stood the test of time and stood with us despite the kind of political context and backlash that Kent is talking about, to support the kind of work that we hope is going to contribute to progress on social justice and gender justice globally through accountability, through the kinds of accountability mechanisms that Global 5050 represents. I also clearly want to give a huge thank you today to today's esteemed panelists who shared not just their immense experience, but immense evidence and expertise, but also their lived experience with us, which is so important in terms of the narratives and the inspiration for younger generations of young lawyers coming along. I want to thank James for joining us on Chinese New Year and to wish you Gong Xi Fat Joy, and may your new year bring peace, justice and prosperity to you and yours. Thank you to Govindi and her amazing team of diligent, dedicated and incredible researchers, without whom none of us would be here talking about the incredible evidence that they have produced today. And last but by no means least, thank you to everybody who has joined the call today, everybody watching on YouTube post hoc, for sharing your time with us and for joining us in the ongoing struggle for gender equality and gender justice for all people everywhere. Thank you.
Well, Sarah, you know, that's the beautiful thread that you gave us there, because of course the closing screen captures the words that you just shared. Join us in defending justice together. And as we do, the Global Justice 5050 report offers a baseline for accountability and a real tool for real action. We encourage you to read the report and use the evidence to ask the difficult and uncomfortable questions to drive change within your own institutions. On behalf of everyone here, thank you very much for being with us. Take care and see you again.